first of all, hello to everybody. And we have some visitors on with us too. So I'm really glad to see so many online. And right now we're planning that in March, we will be at the Horner Park Hall, and that we should be good to meet in person in that. So that's what we're planning. But tonight, Jonathan has prepared a program with some videos in that on the jumping worms. And of course, all of us are really concerned, since that has been a topic that's impacting on the May market and our perennials that we normally would divide that we can't do now. So we'll talk a little bit more, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jonathan so that he can do the program.
Thank you so much, Peg. I appreciate it. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about jumping worms. And as a, not as a spoiler alert, but it may not, it will certainly impact decisions made for our dividing perennials. There's still some opportunity for us to share our perennials from our gardens. My talk will talk a little bit about that. And so it just will, if we do decide to do that, will require some effort on our parts. So with that, I'm just to kind of manage expectations, if you will, that on my talk. I'm going to be, like I said, I'm going to be talking about jumping worms. And first and foremost, can you see, do I get a thumbs up that you can see my screen? Okay. All right, super. I first and foremost want to let you know that I am, one, not a master gardener. I am not a master naturalist. This talk is not, again, not set at the master gardener, master naturalist level. It is more of, for like myself, a novice. However, I have done, I think, a pretty good research from credible sources. Redeemed myself from last month in trying to at least present what are jumping worms, okay? And how can I identify them? And I thought worms were good. What's the problem? So what? Well, there'll be a few slides just to kind of, and I'm hoping that this will be discussion. Again, I'm not the expert here, but again, trying to keep it at the novice level with being an informed novice, an informed gardener. And there will be 3 videos at the end. And again, this is being recorded. And so if you like what you see and want to see it again, you can, or have your friends see it and at a later date. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Due to some of the technicalities of this, I'm going to be unsharing and sharing my screen just simply because of some of the interesting challenges. So if you will bear with me as you see my screen going in and out, it just happens to be, that's just the uniqueness of this. And I'm not quite as skilled as Brenda, but Brenda does this every day. So with that, the first one is we're gonna Fox News.
Worms are wiggling its way into the Midwest.
Yeah, Fox News' Catherine Hetzel has more on how jumping worms.
Can you hear it? Can you see it?
And how they're impacting our landscape.
Jumping worms refers to a group of worms, not just one species, that originated in Asia and has been introduced into the United States.
They're called jumping worms because when they get startled or harassed by a person or another animal, they thrash around almost like a snake would. They're very sort of violently jumping, trying to scare away a predator.
Kad Yankowski, senior entomologist with the Butterfly House, says jumping worms were first discovered in the Midwest in 2013. Recently, experts with the University of Illinois Extension say the invasive worms have been found in the Metro East.
They're in Illinois, they're in counties right across the border, so they're probably in the St. Louis area as well.
Jumping worms are certainly not the first non-native worms to find their way into our ecosystem.
All the worms that we have that you commonly find in the soil are invasive or introduced species, usually from Europe or Asia.
But Yankowski says the problem with jumping worms is that they churn through soil much more quickly than other worms, which can cause major disruptions.
They live in the very topmost layer of soil, some of the most nutrient-rich soil, which is really important for trees, seedlings, and things like that to sprout and develop and sort of get established. And they alter and use that food source up to the point that other animals sort of get displaced or plants get displaced in the process.
It may be impossible to eradicate jumping worms, but right now scientists are hoping to slow the spread.
Be mindful if you're moving topsoil, if you're moving plants, especially if you're using worms for fishing. That was possibly one of the ways they got introduced to the Midwest in the first place.
Jumping worms have a distinct band near their heads and can obviously be very active. Yankowski says if you see one, take a picture to document it, and then put it in a bag and set it in the freezer or sun to kill the worm.
As they're coming into the area, they're sort of the new pest invader.
Reporting Catherine Hessel, Fox 2 News.
An invasive species.
Okay, all right.
What date was that, Jonathan? Do you know offhand?
Thank you. That was May 2021. That was just last year. Thank you. Good question. Okay. So if you will, go back here. And okay. So there we go. So for jumping worms themselves, and that was just to kind of like whet your appetite. You're going to hear some things perhaps repeated, but again, once you hear it repeated a few, well, at least 1 or 2 times, that will help to drive in some of the details. But not, they're basically of the jumping worms. There are 3 species. You can see I am not even going to attempt to do the Latin. If you will, the earthworm itself, the one that we would most commonly, our night crawlers, are of the in the family of the mega, pronounce the last part. So we think all worms are the same, but they come from different species. I don't quite, I'm not in that kind of a person to understand it, but I know it's a different family. Okay, and the jumping worms, or you may hear me refer to as the jumper, it ranges from size of 1.5 inches to 8 inches of length, and they originated from Japan and Korea. The first records, if you will, date back to the 19th century, but they're relatively unknown not as well known as our European earthworms. Okay, European earthworms. Well, perhaps in the video, you heard that worms themselves that we have here in North America, they actually were the Ice Age eliminated, or if there were earthworms, the Ice Age eliminated them. And so the earthworms that our night crawlers, those actually came from Europe. Well, how did they do that? Well, most likely they came from being stowed aboard ships in the bottom, in the ballast kind of area, the stuff in the barrels that came out, and those earthworms were introduced a long time ago. They are a much slower populating kind of species. They are quote technically non-native, and they are less invasive. We'll get into the goods and the bads a little bit later on. Anyway, so I'm getting off track. I see some stuff in the chat, so please, I'm not monitoring the chat while I'm doing it. So if there's important questions in the chat, I'll leave it to you, Al, to speak up and have that and bring out the questions if they're relevant. Okay. So to the untrained eye, jumping worms look a lot like earthworms. Okay, well, until, again, I said untrained eye, until they move, they you and I might recognize them as they thrash about. I'll have a picture here in a minute to kind of show you the difference to help train our eyes a little bit. They're brown like most worms. They can be iridescent looking, and they have that ring, or it's pronounced ilium, a ring around their body that is flat. And whereas most other earthworms, that ring is enlarged. My next slide will show that. So here is the jumping worm. You can see it looks almost kind of, in some ways, to me, it looks a little, of course, it could be the photograph, a little bit translucent. The arrow is pointing to the ilium. It's very flat with its body. And that is without even disturbing this worm, this before it started thrashing, as you saw in the video, this is how this looks, what this looks like. Compare this now to a standard earthworm, where you can see this night crawler, that ilium is enlarged, and it is not smooth with the body. So an easier way to recognize. So I'm going to pause here in case there's any questions.
Jonathan, do they coexist with earthworms like regular night crawlers?
Oh, that's a good spoiler alert. They will coexist. They will be in the ground. They don't necessarily attack each other. However, as we'll learn in a few slides ahead, the jumping worms each eat so much that they're invading that territory, if you will. And they're also there's a different layer of habitation, but there's still an area of competition, if you will. Good question. All right. So with that, I am going to go to my next video, and this is from the University of Illinois. And if you hang with me, please. Yes, okay. I have multiple screens open, so I'm trying to figure out which which screen I have to open. Okay, thanks. Oops, wrong one. Thanks for your patience.
Why doesn't every home in the U.S. have solar
Sorry,
panels? The number one
I
reason
thought I
is
would
not about
avoid the
sunlight or
ad.
weather, or even
There we go.
Welcome back to This Week in the Garden. I'm Richard Henschel, horticulture educator.
Can you hear
for
it?
the
See it?
DuPage, Kane, and Kendall counties. And while we are normally outside shooting, today is awfully wet, and I brought the project inside. This week I wanted to talk about jumping worms. Jumping worms is an invasive worm that's shown up in Illinois since 2015. We saw it first in Wisconsin in 2013. And when we found it in DuPage and Cook counties in 2015, that was our first time. But by now, in 2016, they are in 10 counties here in Illinois, 4 in northern Illinois, northeast Illinois, and the other 6 farther south in southern Illinois. The problem with the jumping worm is it's very vigorous, very prolific in its numbers. There'll be 10 times the amount of worms in any given 4 to 6 inch soil profile than we have for our native worms. The concern is, especially in the forest floors, that they can eat and consume all the organic matter that's laying there on the soil surface. You can see here that they're moving very, very quickly. They're very vigorous. They really don't like to be held at all. And while I have them, there's an ID feature right here. The ilium goes all the way around the worm compared to our typical earthworms, which you can see the speed at which they move. Very, 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 and they will just crawl right out of the container, usually in seconds. They're probably getting a little tired now. But there's the ilium that goes all the way around. Thanks for watching this week. We'll be back again real soon.
Okay. All right. So, can you see my slide? Great. I might be getting the hang of it. The life cycle of the jumping worm, it is a little different than the European. The actual jumping worm itself only lives one growing season, whereas our typical European earthworm could live several seasons. That it has egg-filled cocoons that they shed from the previous year. The actual eggs themselves will winter over in the soil, and they will hatch in this. They'll begin hatching in the spring. It takes roughly around 60 days for that jumping worm to become from a new hatchling to a reproductive adult. So perhaps in the earliest part of the spring, depending on how things warm up in your area and maybe your little ecosystem, perhaps those first worms that you see are not jumping worms. But again, if you recognize, their behavior and things of that, and that ileum, that might be a telltale sign. But the first worms probably are not the jumpers, especially if they're of any size. Those new hatchlings are going to be small. As soon as they do reach maturity, they begin reproducing. They do not have to mate to reproduce. So hence, that's another reason that adds to that how much that they can become, their populations can grow so fast and accumulate as the summer progresses. The actual the cocoons, this is very much enlarged. That is a small little ruler that you can see. Those cocoons have been hydrated, but they're really, really tiny. And that could easily get caught up in, plants, tires, or what have you, and could be easily moved and spread. So that brings, so to give you an idea of, how can I be able to see these little baby eggs? Well, they're very small, very small.
Hey, Jonathan.
Yes,
Sorry.
please.
Those are millimeters, right? On the ruler, those are millimeters?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, ma'am. I don't know for a fact. I believe so, and I qualify that. It was a photo that I had. It's from the University of Vermont. There was no qualifier on that photo, but I owe you that. But I do know they're very small. Okay, good question. Anybody else? Okay, so hey, Jonathan, what's the big deal? Hey, I thought worms are good, right? Well, we've kind of did a few spoiler alerts here. And I've already told you that earthworms themselves are not native, or if you want to get technical, they're really non-native. But we always think earthworms are good for the soil because they go in and they help to aerate. And hey, the worm castings. Well, yeah, standard earthworms, for the most part, are appreciated in the garden, and while they do affect the ecosystem, I would say, this is non-technically speaking, I believe their benefits perhaps come equal to whatever they detract from. They, as you can see here, they do in fact alter the soil structure and forest chemistry to some degree. And so we could argue as to it's positive or negative. On the jumper side, though, they stay very close to the surface, very close, whereas the standard earthworms go down several inches and help to go up and down, come to the surface and go back down. But the jumpers, they stay really close, and they are voracious consumers of organic matter, the leaf debris, vegetation debris, and they will just eat it all up. And you would think, okay, doesn't that what about what comes out the back end? Won't that be good? Well, interestingly, for a jumping worm, it's not. It comes out this coarse, coffee ground-like substance that it's void of good richness, and so the worm itself doesn't. It eats the debris that's up on top. Other seedlings and other, whether it's vegetation or critters that are depending on that forest floor, it's not there. And because so most of the time, one of those emails that was sent around, how can you, I think you can put some sort of a I'll call it a Texas tea or whatever that you put on the ground, you can get those jumping worms to come out of the ground. It's because they live close to the surface. But anyway, so that being the case, that is the big deal, but they do not help. They just they devour, and they can be easily spread. You can, by sharing your plants from your garden with the soil still attached, you can inadvertently give this your friend, whether near or far, a jumping worm. If you dump your fish bait or mud in your tires going out into the woods, having a good time, or mud left on your garden tools, etc., you can help to share that. Now, yeah. Right now, how long have they been here? Well, you heard in the videos, they said 2013. I just put approximately 2012 because I think if you first probably saw it, but there was one report that would suggest that it could be earlier, but roughly speaking, in the Midwest, we're talking about relatively new, in the past, if you will, 10 years or less. In the East Coast, they've been there for decades. Up in the Northeast, several decades. I looked at a few reports from like Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire. So East Coast, West Coast have had them. Now you can see as on the slide, in the Midwest, they're being discovered in these states. I did not find one of where the most recent counties. I looked across the what I could find, and maybe someone else can find a better source than me. But the one that I did find for Illinois shows that our county, St. Clair County, has them. I know I have actually seen them in this county, so they're here. So, all right. So does that mean that we just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, if we're cognizant, we can perhaps slow things down. We can perhaps try to, be good stewards in not spreading that. And so it may be inevitable. We may be able to slow it down. There may be things that we can do to curb that. I have my next video is about, well, what if I want to share my plants? What can I do? So I think it's a pretty good video. So I'll stop in this and I'll get down to the next video. It'll be my last video.
My name is Erin Buckholz. I'm the Integrated Pest Management Specialist at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. And today I'm going to show you how to prevent the spread of jumping worms when you're trying to share plants from one place to another. That is one of the main ways that we spread jumping worms, is if we dig it out of the ground, soil and all, put it in a new place, we've taken the worms with us. So the first thing you want to do is set up your space with clean tools, and making sure you have a hose with some water handy and also a bucket with.
This is the world's first reusable cotton swab. It removes up to 5 times more excess earwax.
Unpaid political announcement.
Trusty soil knife right here. As you can tell, I've done a pretty good job cleaning it off. You can't really see any soil on it. If there's caked on soil on your tools, make sure you clean those off in the last place that you worked. You always want to make sure you're starting off with a clean tool, because that's another way that worms can jump from one place to another. Is you've got mud on here. Their cocoons look like peppercorns, except they're even smaller than that. They blend right in with the mud, and that's a way that you can spread from one area to another. So I've got a clean soil knife. I'm going to divide some of this lily of the valley and show you how to clean it off so that you can properly, safely take it from one area to another without taking the worms with you. All right, I have my lily of the valley right here, but I don't want to take all this soil with me because I guarantee there are jumping worm cocoons all over this soil. If I plant it in a new place, those worms are going to hatch and they're going to invade the new garden. So the way that I can prevent that is by shaking off the soil back where I dug it out from, getting as much of it off before I get it wet as possible. So I'm shaking it off. I'm kind of tapping it against the sidewalk here to help me get as much soil off as I can. Put it right back where you found it. But you can see, even doing that, I still have soil here. And again, there's probably cocoons in there. So I have a couple options. I have a bucket of water right here. I'm dunking it in the water. I'm swishing it around for a little while and trying to wash off as much as I can. That's better. There might still be a little bit in here. So maybe I'll have 2 buckets of water just to do a final rinse. But as long as I'm looking at it and I don't see anything, I've got a little bit more right here. So I'm going to try and wash that off too. That looks a lot better. I don't really see any big chunks of soil. So that's one way to do it. But another way to do it that I think works even better is I have another one here. I already tapped as much soil as I can off, but there's still a little bit left. So if you have a garden hose handy, what you can do is go over to it. These shutoff valves that are made out of brass are my best friend because they do a really high pressure spray. You can also attach them to any other garden hose nozzle that you want to. And it's a nice way to shut off the water when you're not actively using it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to wash off my plant in the same area here so that I'm not spreading worms from one area to another. I'm just going to wash the soil right back into the bag. I'll wash in the nooks and crannies of the plants too. So no soil is in the leaves or in the buds. Look at that. I think it's even cleaner than the bucket method. So this is my favorite one. So that's one way to clean off your plants. Make sure that you're washing inside too, because there might be some soil hidden, but usually most of it is going to be here. Look for anything that looks like a grain of sand and just make sure it's as clean as possible. Now your last step is always to clean off your tools before you move on to another area. Look at my trowel, my soil knife. It is just full of soil, and I guarantee it's full of jumping worm cocoons too. I don't want to take this somewhere else. So in the same area I was digging, I'm going to wash off my tool. First, I can scrape it off with my hands, get off as much soil as possible, put it right back where I was working. I'm not increasing my jumping worm numbers at all because it's the exact same place I was working. But I still don't want to leave it like this. I want to get it clean. So with my shut-off valve, again, I'm going to wash off my tool, get off as much of the soil as I can, try and get it as clean as possible. Because remember, these cocoons are about the size smaller than a peppercorn. They are usually only about 1 to 3 millimeters in diameter, which is pretty small, easy to miss. So I'm washing off my hands too. Get as much mud off as possible. Now, my bucket that has all this icky water in it probably has jumping worm cocoons in it too, right? I can pour it right back to where I was digging, where I removed the plants from, because again, I am not moving worms from one area to another. I'm keeping them all in the same original spot. So I'm going to pour out my water and then I'm going to rinse out my bucket right in the same spot. Wait, I'm not done yet. For any sort of plant pest issue, I like to use Lysol or the generic equivalent because Lysol, as we learned from COVID, kills just about everything that's a problem, right? So I could still have some soil-borne fungus on my trowel. You know, even the water washed off most of it, but what if it didn't get it all? I want to disinfect my tools. And this is always good practice when moving from a place to another, even if you don't have jumping worms, because there's a lot of stuff in the soil and a lot of stuff with the plants that we work with that could transfer from one plant to another. So After I wash it off, here is my generic Lysol. Not going to show you the label because it's sold in under many, many different names, but pretty much every hardware store, garden center, something will have a disinfectant that's a Lysol variety. So I'm going to just go spray off my tools completely. Within 30 seconds, it's all right. I can spray off my bucket too if I want to. I'm going to tell you, usually I don't, but I'm just doing this for the camera. But usually getting it a thin covering of Lysol on it. It'll kill any pathogen. I don't know if it kills the cocoons or not, but it definitely makes me feel better. So always start with a sanitized tool and always end with a sanitized tool. So thank you for joining us.
All right. So, in addition to what was discussed on the slide on the videos, other ways to minimize the spread, certainly to choose to grow new plants from seeds, it would be one option. Select plants and seedlings that were raised in more of a commercial soil mixture, or as we saw in the video, bare root seedlings, something for you to consider. Do not share from your garden unless you thoroughly remove. I think that has been driven home. Keep your own soil in your garden. I must admit, the last video that we had, my hat's off to that lady. I think I'll take better note of how I take care of my tools and the soil and the like. As far as what was brought up in earlier videos, when you do discover these worms, place them in a plastic, destroy them. And this kills me because I don't like to destroy things. I don't like to destroy God's creations. Those of you that have been around me long enough to know that. But it is encouraged to destroy them. By doing so, you can put them in a plastic bag, set them in the sun or in the freezer, and report to, take a photograph, as was been mentioned, or report such that where you've discovered this, especially if it's in an area that has not been documented, report that to the University of Illinois Extension Service. And before we get to the discussion, I just want to let you know that I've gone to my last page here, credits, the 3 videos, and then there's a wonderful, which I didn't show this evening, wonderful broadcast. You'll get this information from PBS, University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum. The presentation was an hour and 15 minutes, phenomenal presentation. I would encourage you, if you want to know more, or if you want to look at the University of Illinois Extension, their forestry bulletin on invasive and jumping worms. There's really good. There's a fair amount of information out there if you want to know. So with that, I'm going to go. This is discussion time. I'm going to stop share. And if you have any questions, I didn't see any that were specific in the chat that haven't already been answered. So that's all I have. Happy to anyone has either insights, experience, or would like to add or subtract to what I presented this evening.
Jonathan, just one question. They gave us the formula for getting them to come to the top. Had they come up with anything that can be sprayed on things to remove them?
I'm sorry, my research has not, I didn't get into that part as far as for this presentation. I offer that to anyone who might know that, or if not, that's something we need to follow up with for sure. Thank you.
This is Sharon. Couple of different things, but first of all, with regard to that question, I've been talking with the U of I Extension folks lately to include Chris Evans, whom is kind of designated the lead jumping worm person for the state of Illinois within the Extension Service. And he hasn't mentioned anything. And in the context, I didn't ask that direct question, but in the context of what I have asked, I think he would have responded with such if there was something that could be sprayed. So I don't think so in terms of on the dirt. But two other things. With regard to disinfecting things, Lysol was an interesting idea. What we've generally been using in COVID is alcohol. And pre-COVID, when talking with the Illinois Native Plant Society folks and also the Star Hill Arboretum folks, what they suggest for disinfecting tools is alcohol spray, and as opposed to bleach, because bleach corrodes steel and iron and such, and alcohol does not. So, you know, for a long time, I've been spraying my pruners and such when I prune my fruit trees. Between every single snip, I give my snippers a alcohol spray to not move plant diseases from branch to branch and such. So I would think that, you know, given as how in the video she was referencing information from COVID, I would think that alcohol spray would also work, but haven't asked that question either. And with respect to the Northeast, and I mean, on the jumping worm presentations that were given a couple of years ago when I was taking the Master Naturalist class and such, they were talking about how in the Northeast, the European worms had caused problems there with reducing the amount of mulch on the forest floor. But I hadn't heard anything about jumping worms being present on the East Coast before, or especially in the Northeast, Jonathan. So I was wondering if for sure you had heard that it's jumping worm that's been for a long time in the Northeast, or just that they have had some organic matter reduction issues in the Northeast. I mean, and the organic matter reduction isn't nearly to the extent that jumping worm does it, but it was less than what those plants evolved with.
I have not had classes in this. I do have sources which did talk about it. I can provide those sources later on if you like, you know, but good points.
I have a question. So when we go to nurseries to purchase plants, can we assume that they're probably safe, or that we need to de-dirt them and start over? Or what should, you know, our plan of attack be with that?
I'll put in my 2 cents in and ask for other gardeners to jump in this pile of dirt. I would believe that what you're, for the most part, from an established greenhouse nursery, that you'd be getting seedlings that would be coming from soil which is, you know, commercially prepared. It doesn't mean that it's 100%. Doesn't mean that something wasn't carried on the bottom of the tray because it was set down on the ground or what have you. But I would think that the chances, if you are significantly reduced. But I will yield to the other senators and representatives in the group.
Thank you.
a whole bunch of different diseases and such have been introduced, and invasive species of both plants and animals have been introduced on nursery stock. However, so long as Jonathan said, you're dealing with reputable nurseries, I mean, there really isn't anything better that we can do as general consumers. I wouldn't think.
One thing, the cocoons are killed by temperatures of, I believe it's 105. And most things when they're commercially making compost, they get those temperatures up to 130. So at that case, all those cocoons would be killed.
Good to know. Okay. Well, thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.